Perhaps not the last, though. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome Shetland. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a while since I've actually been on the mainland of Shetland. So it's just wonderful to be here after so long. So today's discussion is looking at the distinctive role of the Scots in 19th century searches for the Northwest Passage, which I think is slowly starting to come out of the shadows. It's being recognised. And if I might be permitted a moment of self-indulgence, I would bring your attention to a very recent book that came out by my late husband, Edward J. Cowan, it's called Northern Lights, the Scots in the Arctic, and it came out in 2023. I had the dubious honour of having to do a lot of the editorial work on it in order to bring it to completion. And it is, in my rather biased view, a must-read book on this subject if you are interested in that. Anyway, enough shameless promotion. So my talk today, it's not intended to be a complete polished paper, as we've heard from some of the previous speakers. Rather, it's been framed as a thought piece on how should the story of Scottish Arctic exploration be communicated, but also asks whose voices dominate, whose voices are more opaque. And a more daunting question to consider is the legacy of colonialism and whether this has made discussing Scotland's 19th century Arctic explorations even more challenging in the modern world. I have certainly been in many situations where I've been told I have no business talking about it because it's all evil and bad and we did terrible things, so let's just forget about it and kind of whitewash over history and everybody be happy. So yeah, for me that's not the way forward, but anyway. My own interests in the Arctic are very wide and varied, ranging from Greenlandic folklore to cultural aspects of the polar bear to Arctic explorers such as John Ray from Orkney, John Ross from Stranraer. I'm particularly interested in their engagements with the natural world, and I'm currently working on the incredible John Richardson from Dumfries, where I'm currently based. Now, for the past 18 years or so, almost every summer, I've had the exceptional pleasure of having worked in virtually all parts of the Arctic now, except for the Russian Arctic. It's not looking too good for me ever getting there, but we can talk about that again. I work as resource staff for a Canadian expeditionary company called Adventure Canada. So my comments today are therefore a kind of blend of my experiences as an Arctic and North Atlantic tour guide, but also my academic study into Arctic exploration, and also my role as a university lecturer, and I'm also a program director of a tourism program, Sustainable Tourism and Global Challenges. So yeah, you can see I'm kind of all over the place. Some of my courses on wildlife tourism, I've got another one on sustainable heritage management. I do bring in the North Atlantic and the Arctic quite a lot. And then last but certainly not least, my conversations over the years with the Inuit and other non-Indigenous peoples who have chosen to call the Arctic their home. Now, despite the fact that very few people, until comparatively recent times, had ever been to the Arctic, it had been of great interest to Europeans for some 400 years or so, or even longer if you include the settlements of the Norse Vikings who settled in kind of the west coast of Greenland. As Hugh Brodie puts it, he says the Arctic has been viewed as imaginary and metaphor, as challenge and menace, as romance and adventure. Over this long period of contact, the dominant narrative has been that of white, intrepid explorers, brave whalers encountering an untamed land and an equally untamed indigenous population. The Moravians and the Anglicans brought Christianity to the Inuit. The Scottish whalers introduced the Inuit to square dancing and the accordion and all that good stuff, and they still play lots of Scottish music. It's so weird. They've just appropriated it into their culture as their own. The explorers also brought all manner of wonders to the Inuit to trade with, such as wood, metal, sugar, tea, and the incredibly popular colourful beads, which again have been appropriated and they make absolutely beautiful clothing items now. They also brought previously unknown diseases with them, things like tuberculosis, influenza, all those nasties. But perhaps most significantly, as Dorothy Harley Eber puts it, the whites carried with them the virus of new thinking. They were the vectors of irrevocable change. Now, 19th century narratives of Arctic explorers, they do tend to reinforce the differences rather than the similarities between white and Inuit, of the white presence there to transform rather than to adapt to the ways of the Inuit. They also had a tendency to idealize the experiences of the whites, to portray them as pioneers of discovery, which they undoubtedly were, I'm not questioning that, but also to cast them as heroes in their own stories, engaged almost in a sort of battle with the elements, of the rigors that they endured, of long periods spent trapped on the ice, of loneliness and isolation, in a sort of combat with the elemental forces of nature. When you read the narratives, they're often framed in that kind of language. Now, as a historian, which is predominantly what my field is, I don't necessarily have a problem with this, with reading such narratives, because they really are a true reflection of 19th century mores and attitudes. What I do find more problematic is the continued concentration of quite a lot of 20th and even 21st century histories of the North that still put the focus on these kind of few individual heroicized adventurer types and the kind of language that comes along with that. With the Inuit included, if included at all, as kind of minor bit part players in the saga. They kind of get written off, oh yes, they were helpful, and that's about all you hear about them. Now, if there's one thing that I'm using that kind of, the royal we, I suppose, for those of us who come from the former colonial powers, must continually remind ourselves is that we do not necessarily know what is best for others. Sometimes we think we do, but we don't always know what's best for ourselves. But we're awfully good at telling other people what they should be doing. It's a kind of a British legacy, if you like, British Empire legacy. And that is a persistent mistake or assumption that most of the white travellers to the Arctic in the 19th century repeatedly make, including the Scots. So communicating stories about Arctic explorers has overwhelmingly been led from the visitor's point of view, with much less emphasis on Inuit perspectives. The colonialist mentality, which has not yet disappeared in some quarters, it's dying out, to be fair to say, but it's not gone yet. It tends to be infused with a desire to offer solutions. Again, we are going to come along and fix all your problems for you. We've probably created your problems in the first place, but let us come and fix your perceived problems. And often those so-called solutions were, and sometimes still are, construed as bringing civilization to supposedly remote and by extension more primitive peoples, those allegedly closer to nature and at some removed from cultured society. And that mentality, I think it should be pointed out, it's not just restricted to people in far-off lands or indigenous populations, but also imposed on certain peoples here in the UK as well. We might think of the Cornish or the Welsh or the Scottish, particularly the parts of Scotland assumed to be more remote or uncivilized, like the Highlands and Islands or the Northern Isles. That's not my view, by the way, before people start chucking things at me. It's just that was a very prevalent view at the time. Now, the North, however that might be interpreted, has been repeatedly shoved to the outer margins. We've heard a bit about that already today. And I personally believe the time is long since past to stop thinking in terms of centres and peripheries, in using this kind of language of remoteness. Like, what on earth does that mean? Remote from what? There was an image on earlier today in the morning of London we're remote from London. well, so what? Maybe London is remote from us. We have to sort of turn these things on your head. And this part of the world used to be the center of everything in its past. So we don't need to think in that way anymore, whether that be Iqaluit versus Ottawa or Kirkwall versus Edinburgh. The time has also come to stop telling and to start listening. Now, there have, of course, been some exceptions to the rule. I would refer to Dorothy Harley Eber's work, which it's based on her interviews that she did across Nunavut, Eber, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce her name, between 1994 and 2008, so actually quite a while ago now, and it was published as Encounters on the Passage, Inuit Meet the Explorers, came out in 2008. And her work illustrates the deep time of Inuit oral tradition, and the kind of oral tradition that we in Scotland once had as well, and is now sadly lost, really. And the memories that can be retrieved, memories going back an incredible amount of time. Just astonishing, really. There are stories that have now been corroborated of Inuit messages for the very beginnings of the search for the Northwest Passage. So that's taking us right back to Martin Frobisher in 1576. Unbelievable when you think about it, but it is true. And so the other thing about oral histories is that they can offer a very important insights into the Inuit point of view. For example, Netsilik Inuit retained stories of what were initially frightening encounters with kind of otherworldly looking beings who had very white skin. They had no fur on them, they weren't dressed in fur, and they wore these kind of black clothes and seemed at first to be Torngat, which is a Inuktitut word for a spirit, until their Angakok, which is an Inuktitut word for a shaman, called Kiktutunaruk, reassured them that they were not Torngat, but they were Kalanat, which means white people. The story goes that Abaluktuk was the first Inuk to spot the strangers, and he was so scared that he ran away so fast that the kind of tail of his parka started flapping about. Now, if you know anything about Inuit clothes, it's not going to do that naturally because it's made of seal skin. The whole point is that it hugs your body quite trimly. And apparently, I can't make you laugh because it's after lunch and everybody wants to go to sleep. But for subsequent listeners of the story, this apparently was hilarious, this vision of Abaluktuk just pegging it because he saw these Torngat. Now, the particular Kalanat, where it turns out it was John Ross from down my part of the world, who hailed from Stranraer, and his crew on the paddle steamer Victory on Ross's second expedition in 1830. And the place that Netsilik and Ross's men first met was named Kablunakivik, the place for meeting white people. So it's very literal. It's located on the east coast of the Boothia Peninsula, and if I had been a more organized person, you would be seeing a nice map right now. So I don't have a PowerPoint, you'll have to Google it, but it's just sort of to the west of Hudson Bay. It's still called that to this day, by some anyway. John Ross's narrative of a second voyage supplies a written account with some illustrations of the very same meeting. And the mainly positive relationships that were formed during the 3 overwinterings that the crew faced. They were stuck in the ice for 3 years, which was a record at the time because of the thick ice conditions. For example, Ross talks about an Inuk called Tuliahu who had lost a leg to a bear. We don't know how exactly, but the leg was not his anymore. It belonged to the polar bear. And a wooden leg was fashioned by Ross's carpenter, the ship's carpenter. We actually saw a picture of him earlier in Carol's presentation. And Ross warmly acknowledges the assistance that he and his men got from the Inuit with food, with map making, with geographical information. And 2 decades later, in 1854, John Ray was also reporting similar helpful assistance and relying on Inuit information to help uncover the fate of the Franklin expedition. Inuit stories were told of efforts to actually help some of Franklin's survivors, the kind of beleaguered crew members. But by the time the Inuit came across them, the men were acting very strangely. They were refusing assistance. They were clearly suffering the side effects of scurvy or starvation, or who knows, just going slowly mad. In modern times, there are quite divided opinions among the Inuit about what motivated the whites to come to their lands in the first place. Many Inuit have expressed the view that they don't believe the Kalanat, the Kablunas, that's another term for whites, first travelled to the north to be helpful, as they often claimed, but rather came out of self-interest. Now that said, the trade opportunities and access to various provisions that brought the northern peoples, that they brought to the northern peoples, is frequently interpreted as a good thing by the Inuit. The point is, Inuit do not think as one homogeneous block. They're just like everybody else. They've got various different opinions about this. So if you talk to different people, they're going to tell you a different thing. There's certainly lots of angry Inuk out there, don't get me wrong, and they've got every right to be angry. But there's also another side to this. But are there ways of bringing a sort of complementary or competing stories like this, or these kind of competing histories together? I think so. And there is some work being done in this respect. I just mentioned one example, which is Northern Isles focused, and that is, and perhaps Orkney in particular. I'm highly conscious I'm standing here in Shetland, so Shetlanders can tell me otherwise if I'm wrong about this. But Orkney is certainly for some time now been working towards renewing old connections and forging fresh links with Nunavut in particular. The common factors typically stressed are around the extensive connections with the Northern Isles and the Hudson's Bay Company, and also the expeditions of a man we've heard mentioned a few times today already, the native Orcadian Dr. John Rae from Orfyr on mainland Orkney, not mainland Scotland, that other place down south from here. The John Rae Society, it was established, I don't know if there are any representatives of the John Rae Society here. I haven't seen anybody that I know from that group, but it was established in 2014 by a group of dedicated folks intent on restoring Rae's birthplace at Hall Equestrian, but also restoring Rae's reputation, which took, to be fair, a bit of a beating during the whole Franklin disaster. And you'll note he is not a sir like most of the others, or sir whatever. He's doctor, he never got his knighthood. And they're trying really to bring Rae's story out of the shadows and into the light of wider public awareness. I don't really mean this as a criticism, but maybe I do, almost at the exclusion of all the other explorers. Like, they're very kind of narrow. They're almost like Robert Burns lovers. Can't see beyond. Rae's the man. It's like, well, there's actually all these other really interesting guys. No, John Rae. So I'll leave that with you. One of the Society's stated mission statements is to work in partnership to grow and share an understanding of the Arctic through education, research, knowledge, transfer, and cultural awareness. That's right there in their mission statement. The long-term goal is to create a John Rae Arctic Research Centre at Equestrian, which is currently accepting donations, should you wish to show your support. This is when we should have a little commercial break. This talk has been brought to you today by the John Rae Society, but it hasn't. I'm under no connections with them in that way. Now, admittedly, the primary focus of this initiative is on Orkney and it is on John Rae, but such a base, should it come into being, would provide the impetus for much wider collaboration and cooperation across Scotland, perhaps. We should see if that pans out, and also with Nunavut and Greenland. I currently live in southwest Scotland. You cannot really get any further away from Orkney and Shetland in Scotland than where I am. Okay. And southwest Scotland is really the homelands of some other really important Scottish explorers. John Ross, who I've mentioned, his nephew James Clark Ross, and John Richardson from Dumfries. All men who equally deserve their stories to be widely known. So in conclusion, how can I kind of wrap up my comments? At the outset of this discussion, I asked, how should the story of Scottish Arctic exploration be communicated? Maybe what I should have said was, how should this story not be told? History is, and always has been, if we go back to the times of Herodotus, history is what historians write down. History is not, and it never can be, an accurate record of what happened, but rather is an interpretation of what happened based on the available evidence, filtered often through the unique perspectives or biases of the individual historian. What historians choose or choose not to write down is an ever-changing and fluctuating process. Arctic history, I would put to you, is our history. It is a part of Scottish history, it is a part of Northern Isles history. It is a story of incredible, brave men, a few stupid ones as well. It can be exciting, it can be inspirational, it can be epic, but sometimes it is uncomfortable, it is challenging, it is shameful. But it is, in my opinion, a history worth telling and remembering, warts and all. Furthermore, we do not need to heroise the Scottish explorers as often is done. Most of these men were not heroes as such. In my view, the word hero is a much abused term, at least in modern times, often applied to people who are simply doing their jobs. It's just become a kind of, anyway. Or it's applied to people who really just don't deserve it. One person's hero, after all, could be another person's villain. Most importantly, Arctic history, it's not just our history. We don't own it or have exclusive rights to it. Indeed, there's an entire 19th century Arctic history out there in which we Kabluna do not feature at all. Imagine that. John Berger once said, and I promise this is where I'm ending, Berger once said that the way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. So do we now need a new way of seeing the Arctic, perhaps freed from the filtered lens of colonialism? The Inuit, some of whom were among the very first peoples to be encountered by the Europeans when the Europeans discovered the New World, while other groups of Inuit were among the last to be discovered. There's that kind of strange juxtaposition. I personally think they deserve to be more than just a footnote in the history of northern exploration. And if you would like to argue with me about that, you'll have your opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my paper today speaks very nicely, I think, to Inge's and Lizanne's. We did form this panel with an idea of being cohesive and complementary. And we might say different things, but we kind of speak from the same sheets, I think. I'm going to be speaking primarily about literature and film. So taking a different angle onto the interdisciplinary forum that we're having today. And particularly I'll be talking about two specific examples of writers and artists from contemporary Shetland and Greenland, whose traditions are clearly different, but whose methods, and particularly the combination of traditional stories, narratives, materials, and very sort of modern techniques, speaks to a very specific kind of cultural revival that both engage in. So first I'm going to talk about Jessie Kleeman. Kleeman was born in Upernavik, Greenland in 1959 and has been living and working between Copenhagen and Greenland for several decades now. It's only now, very recently, after a good 3 decades of solid work, that she's finally being recognized, both in her native Greenland and Denmark, as well as throughout the world, actually. And her work has been really kind of groundbreaking in terms of bearing certain uncomfortable truths about being indigenous and being an artist, being a woman, and crossing many edges in her identity. There was actually, so unfortunately it's over now, a first major solo exhibition at the State Museum in Copenhagen up until December, I think it lasted, and it was absolutely brilliant. I was lucky enough to be there. Now, her work has been unsurprisingly informed by a constant questioning of identity, located in intersectional terms across multiple edges of gender, nationality, ethnicity, and indigeneity. Ever since Kina Sunga, her first video and the first video art by a Greenlandic artist, ever displayed. It was displayed at her first solo exhibition in Nuuk in October 1988. Both in form and content, this experimental video represents the blueprint, I would say, of Kleeman's oeuvre. Thematically, it literally pushes the question of identity at the forefront of her work. The title, Kinasunga, can be translated both as a statement and a question. Who I am or who am I? Both of them are translations of the same phrase. And the 12-minute sequence of images frames Kleeman's face in different poses, and these are stills from the video, often focusing on her mouth, which never, however, utters any word, and yet is also never static. Formally, the video combines modern media, obviously video and photography, with traditional forms. In this case, as Kleeman herself notes, the video points to the mask dance, or Uajernek, of East Greenland's traditional performances, which the Tukak theatre, where Kleeman trained, has reinvented for contemporary performers and audiences. And this is how she comments on the work herself. The lines have different meanings. She's talking about the lines on her face. The color red represents blood and so on, associated with different spiritual values. In my video, the mask keeps changing because I've added more paint and rubbed out the color until it was completely distorted. So Kleeman's use of body paint replaces the traditional use of soot and whale oil, which you can see actually in the traditional performance makeup. But as a note later, Kleeman also will end up using those kind of more traditional materials and importing them in her own work as well. In this particular instance, however, as it has been noted by reviewers of her work, the video monitor becomes the mask, a force that both mediates her presence and consumes her. So indeed, in this self-reflective performance, Kleeman is, admittedly, as she says herself, both director and performer, both subject and object, both inside and outside. And she constantly moves to cross the boundaries so that her sense of identity remains unanchored, undefined, elusive even. Kleeman's move to Nuuk and then Copenhagen accentuated such feelings of self-reflexive alienation, adding a sense of uprootedness to the already complicated articulation of the artist's identity. Kleeman explores this layer of dislocation that migrancy adds to her existential experience. This disorientated lost self on the margins of the familiar world is symbolized by another pivotal figure in Inuit myth and also her work, the Kivittok. Traditionally a mountain wanderer of Greenlandic mythology who possesses supernatural powers. As Alice Godwin, a reviewer, notes, however, the term also can now be used in a derogatory way to describe someone who has left a smaller community for a larger one. And this duality is particularly relevant to Kleeman's split identity, as seen in the recordings of the live performances of Kivittok, ranging from 2006 to 2008, where the artist is, for instance, as you can see in this still, she's wearing simultaneously a traditional boot, a kamick on one foot and a stiletto heel court shoe on the other, pointing to the ambivalence of the legendary wanderer, a hermit figure who has moved out into nature and gained supernatural strength and power, but who has also left behind home, their village, their families and communities, or perhaps they have been even ostracized from that society. This last quotation is from the curatorial interpretation, which is at least in part, but not wholly, aligned with Kleeman's 2012 poem, which you can see on the slide as well. And Kvittok was written in Danish and translated into German, and this is my admittedly very ropey translation from the German. So it's I don't even know how many times removed from the original, but nevertheless, here it is. And the Kvittok here is a peculiar figure, because what's missing from the curatorial comment, I feel, is the question of colonialism. The homeless person implied in this poem seems to me to be quite obviously an Inuit migrant, not mentioned in the curatorial notes that I was quoting earlier. And although Kleeman really pivots her own personal experience at the center of her installations, the performances also really reflect on the wider Inuit experience. So it's not just her own autobiographical experience. She does reflect more widely, more broadly on what it means to be Inuit today, without wanting to generalize. And really of Greenland as a cultural context that has been made very problematic by the experience of colonialism, which is, of course, ongoing. Now, the use of seal blubber in her orsok performances, orsok means blubber in Greenlandic, and installations, and especially the smearing of real seal liver onto her body during her performance, articulates the ambivalent significance of raw animal materials to contemporary formations of Inuit identity and their colonial relationship to Denmark. The subversive manipulation of the abject aesthetics in Kleeman's work speak both of the desire to reject the ways in which Western colonizers have cast the Inuit ways of life as primitive, and the political intention to assert Inuit agency and embrace the Inuit proximity to and identification with the animal world. Thus, blubber becomes not only a material, but also an integral part of the process through which Kleeman's work interrogates human-animal categorical boundaries and hierarchies. At the same time, such reclaiming of the traditional past is not unproblematic, and Kleeman is aware of the complicated repercussions and insidious mechanisms of internalized colonization and cultural appropriation. Here's what she says. When I was a child, eating blubber was considered shameful because it was associated with coming from a primitive culture. But today, Greenlandic delicacies have become fashionable and something to be proud of. In Nuuk, you will now sometimes find someone shooting a seal or a whale just to sell their blubber and skins. They care nothing about the rest of the animal, or even about the fact that we're dealing with an actual live animal here. What does that make us? Have we become Danes? We've certainly become a different people than we were. While Kleeman's articulations of indigenous identity are always placed in nuanced ways against the colonial control Denmark exercises on Greenland's politics and culture, the wider neo-colonial threats that wound the melting glaciers of Greenland become the center of Arcticus Doloros, the title of a video installation of 2019, which Kleeman was allowed to perform, or rather show, at COP28 in Dubai in December 2023. And also, it's a title of a collection of poetry from 2021, which is right here, and nominated, that was smooth, nominated for the Nordic Council's Literature Prize. Now, I'm going to try and show this clip. Hopefully it will work. Just 1 second. Oh, yeah. Sorry, this is not very smooth. And I'll speak over the sound, because the sound should be quite faint anyway. The title of the performance responds to Barry Lopez's 1986 poetry collection Arctic Dreams. It's captured in a similarly surreal dreamlike trance, but here Kleeman's figure, clad in black, emerges starkly against the crisp blue sky and blinding white icescape. As one reviewer puts it, the fabric becomes something of a battlefield when Kleeman steps onto it, barefoot, entangles herself in it, and unfurls it like a sail behind her, fighting against the wind like a steadfast Madonna of sorrow. While the visible struggle suggests the pain of the title and is inflicted on the human subject by a hostile or at least careless environment, the apparent mourning also implies the notion of landscape wounded by climate change. And this is really what's missing from Lopez's collection. And if this may seem like an interpretation affected by Western aesthetics, the use of artificial materials, nylon fabric, fluorescent light bulbs, a plastic sheet and rope, most of which are plastic-based and therefore derivative products of the extractivist politics responsible for global warming. This points to the convergence of an environmental and cultural wound that's been simultaneously inflicted on Greenland, but also human agency and colonial accountability, which Kleeman's performance pivots around. There are so many claiming ownership, fighting for the Arctic world, but at the same time, she says, there are people who've always lived here, people who live from the land. There is a long history of grief in the Arctic. Now I'm going to pause this, but you can easily find it on Vimeo if you want to see how it pans out. And I'm going to swiftly move on to Roseanne Watt. So while Shetland's history does not share Greenland's colonial trajectory, a comparable sense of cultural loss, nevertheless, and environmental reflections permeate the works of Roseanne Watt, a writer, filmmaker, and musician, as I'm sure you all know, born in Shetland in 1991. Her debut collection, Mother Die, published in 2019, received the Edwin Morgan Poetry Award for Scottish Poets Under 30 in 2019, and several other prestigious prizes. Watt's work to date is pervasively located in Shetland and in its elusive literary and cultural tradition. To understand Watt's island perspective, we may wish to reference the reflections of another Scottish poet, Kevin McNeill, who is also an islander and also multilingual like Watt and like Kleeman for that. And Watt acknowledges him as a strong influence in her own work. Discussing the distinctive positionality of island writers, he notes, perhaps this sense of being other, so often foisted upon the islander, is in the end a problem that can become a solution, in the artist's hands at least. The islander's sense of being removed from the heart of things, the center of power, influence, visibility, enhanced opportunity, relates, I think, to the writer's sense of being an observer as much as a participant. So in McNeill's words, then, the island becomes more than a place a writer can call home, a state of mind, a way of seeing not just the island, but the world around it. As Watt comments, liminality fosters an outward-looking literary perspective, which becomes a rich imaginative space for art to flourish within. In other words, being peripheral invites reflection, both inward and outward, laying fertile ground for the seeds of imaginative thinking about self and place, and simultaneously rooted in the island and carried by the sea wind beyond its horizons. So what we're saying here is that being peripheral actually is an advantage, because from the periphery you can be conscious of being on the margins, but you can also look at the center. Whereas if you are in the center, you'll never be aware of the margins. So it's an advantage, and it's sort of turned on its head for the sake of especially cultural and artistic creation. More specifically, what's central concern revolves around the revival and recuperation of a lost Norn literary tradition in Shetland. Can I just do a quick hand check? How many people here know what Norn is? Everybody, great. So I don't need to say anything about it. Watts Poetics don't simplistically give in to the idealization of Shetland's traditional past. Instead, she uses tradition to reflect, sometimes critically, about such tradition, such as the sin it may conceals. In her poem Selkie, for instance, the traditional Selkie story is turned on its head by imagining a story where the Selkie is not violently deprived of her skin. Some poem is ringing. I'm not going to read the poem here. I'm just going to comment on it. The sense of loss here that pervades traditional Selkie stories no longer relates to the inevitable separation of seals from humans in Selkie romances, but harkens back to the haunting memory of past violence, for instance, that of the sealing tradition. And yet the poem also articulates the deep connection between Shetland's natural features and its language. The word halfman here refers to a deep sea fisherman, and as Watt explains, on a sonic level, Shetland, the dialect of the archipelago, reflects its landscape, hard and open, yet with constant fluctuations of light. I like this wilderness inside it, the way it occupies a poem's heart. I'm going to try and rush to the end of my paper now. In Watt's film work, which complements her poetry, landscape is similarly haunted by a sense of cultural extinction and identity made by loss, a theme that is also sadly painful, of course relevant to many Arctic indigenous people. In response to the extinction of the ancient Scandinavian Norn linguistic and literary heritage, Watt's work reclaims lost words and traditions, and in doing so shifts the margins again into the center and fills the void with shape-shifting imagery which, like the sea creatures of the Arctic, oscillates between life and death, land and sea, past and present, natural and supernatural. In one particular poem, Raga Tree, in Shetlandic, recovered, it means driftwood. She talks about this sort of piece of driftwood recovered by the poet on a local beach, and she explains, over the years it became a strange presence there, commanding an almost fabled gravity, like the body of an ancient sea monster, which was a gift for my own research, because I do, like monsters. And the poem that emerged from that observation, which was included in the collection Mother Die, in the collection, derogatory becomes a central metaphor for Shetland's lost literary tradition, both because of an alleged connection to Shetland's earliest literary record, the Unst Lay, and the Poetic Edda, but also specifically because the image of the rootless tree in a virtually treeless archipelago becomes a fitting embodiment of Shetland's elusive past. The poem has also been made into a film, which I'm not going to show because I don't have time, but again, it's available on Vimeo. And it's part of a series of film poems that Watt has produced to complement her writing, and which address similar things about tradition and this kind of subversive thinking about margins and centers. So to conclude, I'm just going to very briefly suggest some thoughts that we may want to bear in mind. These comparisons of two contemporary writers and artists from Shetland and Greenland has highlighted the complex ways in which, on both sides of the Atlantic, the self-conscious awareness of being on the margins serves to turn the hauntings of cultural loss into cultural and environmental activism. Writing and performing from their respectively remote corners of the far north and the Arctic turns the barren wastelands of conventional cliché views of the world's northernmost areas into a kind of imaginative wilderness that redresses the center margins or south-north hierarchies through which we tend to still map the world today. Such realignment in turn points to the importance of addressing the question of cultural sustainability when discussing the environmental wounds that increasingly mark the Arctic landscape. Thank you.
Long day. So thank you so much for bearing with us for one last sort of incursion. This is a slightly different format, so we've organized it as a roundtable that is supposed to be more conversational and discursive. So it worked really well to just, I think, in a way started with a Q&A, because the point is to also invite the audience to really be part of some of these discussions that we're doing. So sadly, you'll hear a little bit more from me because I'm setting it up and introducing my two colleagues, but then they'll speak more and we'll open up to questions. And we're really also open to any kind of comments and thoughts about some of these questions. So these will be the sort of talks that my colleagues will give, including mine at the top, and they'll be for about 5 to 10 minutes each, so like a shorter one than the panels you've had so far. And sadly, we've lost one. We were supposed to be 4 with Laura Major, based at the University of Strathclyde, who would have talked about some field work she recently did in Orkney and Shetland. So it'll be a bit different, but a lot of the work that's been done is part of a broader project called the Haunted Shores Network that some of you might have heard about. If you haven't, this is something that is very open-facing, and it started between 3 academics, Dr. Joan Passy at the University of Bristol, Dr. Jimmy Packham at the University of Birmingham, and Dr. Emily Alder, that was quoted in one of the previous panels, at Edinburgh Napier University. And the 3 together created a network that looked at shores and coasts and its interrelation with haunting, the Gothic, horror, and other forms of sort of fiction media and so forth. And we run blog posts. We've got a reading group. We've got annual conferences. It's all very virtual as well, in order to sort of promote remote participation. So do look us up. There's a mailing list you can sign up to. And one of the offshoots of that project was the Scottish Shores sort of project, where that first brought together Laura, Monica, Madeleine, and I, and other people who aren't here today. And part of these discussions also are on the website, where it was funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and allowed us to run some events and some discussions, including a first sort of symposium, and then a storytelling day with Orcadian storyteller Tom Ware, that you might know already, that was recorded and is on the website. And as a treat, you also have a really 3 wonderful episodes of a podcast that Monica run called Skeleton Women. So it's kind of offshooted and expanded, and we're thinking about how to further expand it, and it also involves blog posts. So if any of your research or thoughts or ideas are currently being in the work but may not be ready for another form of publication, we really invite them for the blog posts. They're published regularly, and so you can get in touch with either myself or Madeleine Potter, who will be talking about this, because we welcome any of those. So knowing that these ideas are kind of at the back, and the kind of collaborative work that these networks foster, the kind of roundtable we have today is similarly collaborative, where we'll each speak for a few minutes and then invite you to come in. And so I'll start by just briefly introducing my 2 colleagues, and then I'll give a very short talk, about 5 minutes maximum, about one project I'm doing now, and then I'll let them go ahead. So the first person who will speak after me will be Madeleine Potter, who's an early career teaching and research fellow in the literature of the long 19th century at the University of Edinburgh. And she'll tell us about a specific element in Frankenstein and Orkney. And then we'll move on to Monica Germana, that you already have been very lucky to hear speaking, who's a reader in Gothic and contemporary study at the University of Westminster. And she'll tell us a bit more about some of her work related to the Arctic again. All right, so in my case, my presentation is not actually a sort of a prepared paper, but it's actually another form of invitation. I'm currently working with a colleague based at Memorial University in Newfoundland in Canada, a place that's been mentioned already many times today, on putting together a project on heritage, green transition, and island and archipelagic spaces. And essentially our two main ideas were to start thinking about Newfoundland and Shetland and Orkney in terms of energy transition and heritage. But we'd like to also expand it and invite more collaborators. So as I present some of the ideas we want to talk about, if any of you are interested in joining us or talking to us or know of somebody who would be interested in joining us, please make yourself known to me, either by coming and say hi at the dinner tomorrow or just by email as well. So some of the ideas that we'd like to think about are really grounded in idea of heritage. And so this really follows well from the panel that was earlier this afternoon with the two Andrews and Simon, who thought about different forms of heritage. And here I'm starting with this convention by UNESCO of what is heritage, also to kind of grapple with it and the issues of what it means to use terminology like intangible cultural heritage. And here I'm using sort of quotation marks because intangible in many ways, or talking about cultural heritage, sometimes makes it feel like it's less real, less material, less here. But that is not the case for what this heritage means to the people who engage with it, right? What the communities use it for. So one of the things we want to think about in the work we want to do is how these kind of legal and policy and governance formulations sometimes are very much at odds with what happens on the place in the community, and how we can find a more balancing way to engage with how communities think about things and how policy then writes it in. Obviously, it's unlikely that as this project starts, we'll be able to just come and challenge UNESCO, but this is kind of just a train of thoughts that we're starting with. The kind of work we do is also grounded on different ways in which heritage is thought about. And what we are interested in is folding also these ideas on something that is being sort of more published about today, which is this idea of blue heritage, but also sustainable heritage. So how sustainability, environmental, comes into sort of relation with other forms of heritage. And so neither of us are experts in the Shetlandic context, which is why we're also trying to invite people. My own specialism is more about energy transition and heritage narrative and policy and governance. But one way we want to sort of bring things together is obviously through the idea of the small island nation and the archipelagic nation. Now we conceive these. And the different kind of dynamics that exist. So obviously in the case of Newfoundland and Canada, there's very important colonial and settler colonialism dynamics that are at play when it comes to displacing communities, to creating green and energy transition infrastructure, which are really necessary, but also need to be done in certain ways. And this is what my colleague is doing with communities there. So to bring this to the questions of Shetland and then sort of conclude and let the space to my two other co-speakers, the question is about the Viking or Norse heritage in Shetland. So the kind of questions we want to ask in our project, and I'm very curious to know if you have any thoughts about this, is what does it mean when these kind of Norse and Viking sort of narratives and imageries become sort of commodified, either for tourism or for energy transition, which is the question that we're asking. We don't have an answer to it, right? We're asking it and putting it there. So what we're really interested is just to think about how is heritage sort of weaponized or taken over for different ways. And it can be great because it can be about tourism and it can be for the long-term benefits of the community, like the panels earlier was telling us about, but there's sometimes problems where it isn't. And so one example that we hope to explore more about is something I'm sure in the room you all know very well about, is the Aphelia Festival, which itself is also very interesting in the way it's sort of a modernization of tradition, right? So there's a tension here with tradition and modernity that we really are keen to explore when it comes to understanding what it means to articulate heritage in a way. And this is so my last image now, is to think, what does it mean when this is then taken over by companies and corporations for energy transition? So obviously, when it comes to our current climate crisis, it is really important to transition to just and sustainable energy infrastructure and practices. But how is it just, how is it sustainable, and who is it just and sustainable for, are the questions that we wish to ask in this project. And so what does it mean when this kind of heritage that is cultural and for the people then is taken over when it comes to naming, for example, a field of wind turbine, is one of the questions we hope to ask. And so how can we make it just and sustainable socioculturally, economically, environmentally, and for people here, but also think about the global scales that these impacts have, thinking also of petroleum extraction in Shetland. Okay, so this is me. I'm going to let now my colleague Madeleine come over.
Thank you so much, Julia. And so my talk, I'm going to try to be quite brief with it. It's part of a work in progress where I'm kind of thinking about what using the eco-Gothic, which is an approach that kind of wields together eco-criticism with Gothic studies, how it can help us decenter the human when we think about our place in the world and when we think about the environment. So how an eco-Gothic framework can sort of displace anthropocentrism. And in order to do this, I'm just going to talk you through a few thoughts about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Why Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you might ask? Well, partly because it's set in the Arctic and in the Orkneys, partially at least, but also because scholars such as Andrew Smith and William Hughes have argued that eco-critical concerns or environmental awarenesses, as we might call them today, can be traced back to the Romantic period. So far, so good. But these are often tied in with questions of human dominance over nature. And I think this is partly due to our scholarly insistence on the centrality of the sublime in Romanticism. And my point is not to try and say that the sublime is not important in Romanticism. Of course it is. But the sublime is something, I mean, if we go back to Edmund Burke, he defines the sublime in very human-focused terms. He talks about the strongest emotion that the human mind is capable of feeling. Even when we're not talking about the sublime, think, for example, of Wordsworth's poems on the naming of places. So scholars such as Jonathan Bate have read this act of naming places as obviously an act of knowing, and an act of knowing that takes us back to the biblical injunction that God gives to Adam to dominate the world, to know and name the world, right? So it's an act of knowing, it's an act of dominating nature and attributing meaning to it. However, in their introduction to the eco-Gothic, Andrew Smith and William Hughes point out that this is not the case for Gothic Romanticism. That Gothic Romanticism differs from the main trends of Romanticism, if you will, and they go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and propose that really Victor Frankenstein speaks a language that is broken, that is second-hand. I mean, his creation is a second-hand creation. He's quite literally gathering bits and pieces of other people and animal bodies and sewing them together. So he's working with second-hand material. So what happens then in an eco-Gothic vision of landscape? I think that fragmentation is to a certain extent at the core of an eco-Gothic vision, and what I want to suggest is that it is this very fragmentation that's actually instantiating a more ecocentric vision. So to do that, I'm actually just going to think very quickly through Mary Shelley's mention of Coleridge, when in the initial letters that Robert Walton sends to his sister, he's saying that he will go to the land of mist and snow, but he shall kill no albatross, obviously kind of referencing the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It is often taken to anticipate Victor's own transgression, because the mariner kills the albatross, which is a transgression against nature, and this is paralleled to Victor's own act of transgression in creating the creature, modern Prometheus playing God. But what if the transgression is the Arctic exploration itself? What if Robert Walton is himself a transgressor? What if humanity, so to say, is playing where it shouldn't be in all these more minor things? So I think this becomes a bit more obvious when we think about the fragmentation of the female body, the creation of the female body that is abandoned, that Victor attempts to do in the Orkneys. And basically, Victor says, and let me just find the quotation here, as he goes to Orkney, he says, with this resolution I traversed the northern highlands and fixed on one of the remotest of the Orkneys as the scene of my labours. It was a place fitted for such a work, being hardly more than a rock whose high sides were continually beaten upon by the waves. The soil was barren, scarcely affording pasture for a few miserable cows, and oatmeal for its inhabitants, which consisted of 5 persons whose gaunt and scraggy limbs gave tokens of their miserable fate. So it's a bit of a bleak vision there, but it's only bleak if we think about it in human terms. And what Victor is doing here, he's describing the soil as barren, and he's describing his act as his labour. So he's kind of fashioning himself as a monstrous mother. But then the creature is abandoned. It becomes an abortion, essentially. There is great ambivalence, I think, in his abandoning the creation of the female creature. Because on the one hand, we are obviously quite conditioned to sympathise with the monster and to want him to get his partner and just live a happy life. But beyond, I think, the idealism of that vision, what Victor is doing in that particular case is actually, for once, abandoning that act of transgression. So the soil being barren is only bleak if we think of it in conjunction to Victor's labours, to the impossibility of birth. The soil is giving birth itself. But if we were to remove that vision, again, and this came up in a different talk as well, why is it remote? Remote from where? We enter a kind of network of experience, but a network of human experience. Whereas what I think the eco-Gothic does is instantiate here a sense of ontological autonomy beyond this sense of what we make of landscape itself. So why does this matter? I think it is a useful framework for us to think about how we conceptualize spaces today and how we conceptualize things that are Gothic or variously monstrous, because we're so often associating them with anxiety or fear or oppression. But once again, that's kind of leading us into centering the human in that vision. So what if actually the monstrous and the Gothic can be used to frame that sense of ontological autonomy that decenters the human from that kind of hierarchy of creation? So I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for listening, and I'll give way to Monica again.
I've definitely earned my beer, I think, today. So I'm gonna zoom through this. There's a lot of images, but I think at least part of the material will be very familiar to you all. I'm going to talk about the maternal spaces that are associated with the northern waters, and try to draw some conclusions on why we think of waters as maternal, and also what the implications are, particularly when we look at the particular narratives that are associated with these northern and Arctic waters. First of all, I just wanted to kind of contextualize my work. I'm interested in monsters and the creatures that populate, particularly the waters of the far north and the Arctic, both traditionally, historically, but also in the more contemporary cultural productions. And this has not always been the case. If you look at this map, which some of you might have seen before, it's a Ptolemy's map of the world, and it shows the north as a very kind of empty sort of space, and it's surrounded by an ominously named Mare Congelatum, frozen sea, and there's very little detail, in terms of the land contours. If you look more closely, however, you do see that I think it's Shetland there, and it is obviously associated with Thule, the extreme north, the far north. This is something that persists in other later maps. So Ptolemy's map is 2nd century AD. This on the right hand side, as I'm sure you know, is Olaus Magnus's 16th century map, which is much more complex, much more detailed, and filled with monsters, which is what we like. One of the things that basically changes here is the shift from the north as this kind of empty, void, barren space, and a space filled with life, monstrous life at that, but still life, very exciting kind of life, very dynamic kind of life. And this is also reflected in the folklore of the north. We're all familiar with mermaids and selkies, which are very kind of popular and recurrent features of northern folklore. And of course, in this room, everybody will be familiar also with the sea mother. The sea mother is a central feature in the cosmology of the north, in Orcadian folklore, and I think also in Shetland folklore too. The sea mother is the spirit of the summer. She provides life, she calms the water, and everything is good under her rule. But it's not always without its problems, because the sea mother is also constantly fighting, or cyclically fighting, against the northern spirits of the winter. Terran is her main antagonist. When Terran rules in the winter time, there is storms, and life is much harder. She also fights against this other horrible-looking spirit, sea demon, Nakulibi. Nakulibi emerges from the sea again in periods where the sea mother is being challenged, but also peculiarly he's unable himself to cross bodies of fresh water, so he's very afraid of fresh water, and that causes other kinds of problems. Here's another image of the Nakulibi, black and white, but I think this one actually shows the horror of Nakulibi more vividly, because the main thing is that is a kind of anthropomorphic demon, in the sense that he's recognizable as a man, but he's also skinless, so his flesh looks raw, and he's almost all at one with the horse that he rides. So he's also a sort of centaur figure, man with horse. Another kind of maternal metaphor and figuration appears in Watt's poetry that I also mentioned in my previous talk. Mother Dye, which gives the collection its title, is Mother Wave, and Mother Wave is, as Roseanne Watt herself explains, it's a kind of underswell that is meant to always head home, head towards land. And so referring to this undercurrent in her poem, Roseanne Watt attempts to kind of show the complicated space that is the maternal space of the northern water. Much is in the same way as the Sea Mother narrative shows the water as a contested space. So the maternal authority is not just unchallenged, it's constantly being challenged. So does this poem show how life and death have permeable boundaries. There is a sort of seamless continuity in this poem between the sort of life that emerges from death that is clearly intimated at the start of the poem. You wake in the afterlife, spit gravel from your mouth like teeth and cinders. But in the end, life is also very much asserted. The water is effectively pregnant with life. The water is literally compared to amniotic fluid, and also there is a reference to quickening, that first movement that pregnant women will feel when the babies start moving. And there are lots of cultural associations that establish, life, the start of life with quickening, not with the actual start of pregnancy or conception, but quickening, the actual movement of the fetus inside a woman's body as historically been associated with life. And here it comes again. Now, what happens on the other side of the pond? I'm going now towards indigenous Arctic narratives of water. And Sedna is, of course, a central pan-Arctic character that most of you, again, will be familiar with. She is known by various names. As I think Sedna is the one that is more easily pronounced by a Western tongue. But she's also known as Nervik and Sasuma Ana in Greenland. The story of Sedna is one, again, of violence, patriarchal violence against the body of a woman who is married to a bird under false pretenses. This bird sometimes is a pestrel, sometimes is a fulmar. And then when she realizes that she's been married to a bird, she wants to run away. The bird is clearly not very happy about it. And when she calls for help, these men in her family arrive. Her father, in some versions of the story, is her grandfather as well, and her brothers. And they take her on board on their boat. And this bird summons up a massive storm because he's very unhappy about being deserted. And the men decide to throw Sedna overboard. Why not? Because she is the cause of all the trouble. And as she's clinging onto the boat, her hands and fingers are severed by the men on board. And so she sinks to the bottom of the sea, fingerless. And this mutilated body, however, is then turned into the supreme ruler of the ocean. And so Sedna occupies perhaps the highest authority in the cosmology of the Inuit. Most importantly, from her fingers, from her severed fingers, from her mutilated hands, all sorts of life is generated in the form of sea mammals, seals and whales. So the idea is that Sedna, the mutilated body of Sedna, nevertheless produces life, produces sustenance. And that's why in Inuit rituals, propitiation will be very important. Sedna will need to be ingratiated to ensure that sustenance is maintained. That doesn't always happen, and Sedna will be very vengeful if humans don't act accordingly. And it's unclear in the older stories what could particularly trouble Sedna. But it is insinuated that it will be moral concerns, sometimes, abortions or violent events, immoral acts of other kinds. Anything that's disrespectful towards life, Sedna will punish with basically lack of food, with taking away what she's normally known to offer, to give to the humans who rely on her. So there is an environmental agenda that has emerged in contemporary responses to the myth and contemporary rewritings of the myth, which emphasize the idea that the kind of planetary damage that we are responsible for in the so-called Anthropocene era, Sedna is responding to with much anger. And that anger is, of course, seen in the planetary destruction, in climate change, in the rising sea levels and melting of the ice. This is not Sedna's fault, it is the human's fault, but Sedna is channeling her anger. She's warning us about our bad behavior. You can see in contemporary Inuit art that that kind of seamlessness between the animal and human world is very much embedded in these renditions. All the sculptures and the illustrations show Sedna as half human and half animal, sometimes more fish-like, sometimes more mammal-like. Jessie Kleeman again from Greenland. She has also often returned to the myth of Sasuma Arna, and again she draws our attention to the environmental quality that Sasuma Arna's revenge and anger and wrath basically captures. It's all about us and the way we are damaging the planet, and Kleeman here wearing seaweed on her face shows that we need to embrace that myth again to ensure that we are more ethical in our consumption of the ocean and all of its resources. Here she is again bearing it all, showing that kind of vulnerability of Sedna and offering herself to the audience who are always in a state of shock, really, when they see Kleeman perform. More recently, Sedna returns in this short film called Ivalu, which was nominated for an Academy Award, and the first I think Inuit animation to be it's not an animation. It's a film that has animation in it. It's based on a graphic novel, which is currently available only in Danish and French. And Sedna appears in this story both as a protector again and as a monster warning against the sins that a community is hiding. I'm not going to say more in case you want to watch it, but let's just say that there is a father who's done very bad things to his daughter, and the daughter becomes missing. Sedna becomes therefore a warning sign for society that may be ill and sick, and something needs to be addressed. But it's not all doom and gloom. Sedna can also be a very kind of empowering figure. You can see here that this young Inuit woman has her fingers tattooed in the way that reminds us of Sedna's own severed fingers. And these kind of traditional tattoos, which were at one point banned in Canada, are returning to kind of symbolize Inuit agency and sense of identity. So what do we gather from these mothers of the sea? What kind of conclusions can we draw? I think, the kind of conclusion that I want to draw is sort of threefold. First of all, monsters, so to speak, get a lot of bad press, but monsters, for those of us who love them, are prodigies, but also warnings and omens. So in a way, they are calls for action. So we need to listen to monsters. What kind of message do these particular sea monsters give us? What kind of message do these monster mothers deliver? So first of all, the permeability between life and death, articulated both by Mother Dai and Sedna, and the cyclical structure of the sea mother mythology, suggests a reading of time which is circular rather than linear. Such chronological structure in turn suggests a less anthropocentric view of the environment, and one which centers around planetary rather than human time. Such shift from linear to circular time and human to planetary time in turn points to the important environmental warning that is more explicitly embodied in the Inuit legends about Sedna, and particularly the contemporary responses to it. The link between human transgression and environmental damage is as relevant, or perhaps even more relevant today, in the so-called Anthropocene era than it's ever been. And I'll finish here.